ironically, I'm descended from conservatives. Can you believe it? Yes, it's true. Some of my ancestors were what are called United Empire Loyalists, and we ran off from the United States when they started to have their revolution. And we wanted to remain loyal to the crown because I don't actually know what they were thinking, but they wanted to. Now, today is the day after St. Patrick's Day, and of course, because my name is Patrick, I want to tell you a story about Patrick. Today's story is about Patrick Henry. And there's a little story to go with the story, too. When I was a kid, my mother had a scrapbook for me. And she would paste things into it, like moms do, to remember birthdays and grandparents and uncles and aunts and cousins and all those fun things that happen when you're a kid. And right at the very beginning of my scrapbook, there was an article from an encyclopedia. No, not a birth announcement, an article about Patrick Henry, the great American orator. So I learned the meaning of the word orator very young. Whether it made me one, I don't know, but that's where it started. So the story today starts with something about Patrick Henry. He was one of the founding fathers of the USA, not a British citizen. He was the first governor of the state of Virginia, which was one of the 13 colonies. He was a gifted orator and a major figure in the American Revolution against the king. He wasn't exactly a perfect human being. He kind of bombed as a young adult. He didn't know what he was going to do. He had a few jobs that didn't really work, and he was a planter and something else. And ultimately, he decided to work for, I think, a family member at an inn, where he also worked at becoming a lawyer, and did become a lawyer. Once he was legally a lawyer, he had to, of course, become famous for trying something, or at least make a living at it, right? So there was a case that he was involved in, his first major case, called the Parsons Cause of 1763. Now, in the case, it was an attempt to test the limit to which the United States, which would be, that is the 13 colonies, could challenge the crown. So, what was the case? Well, the case is pretty simple. Virginia, the places in the USA, used to pay the ministers of the Anglican Church in tobacco because, money was scarce, right? But they had lots of tobacco. Then, in about 1750 something, they had a drought, which made tobacco much more expensive. It went from an average of 2 pence per pound to 6 pence per pound. So, pence, by the way, that's the English coin of the day. They were about 1 pound would have been equal to about $4. So, these men were paid 2 pence per pound, and that's how the act read. Well, I guess ministers are people too, and they're flawed and maybe a little greedy, and they wanted to get the tobacco so they could have the 6 pence instead of the 2 pence that they were being guaranteed per pound. So they appealed to the king, George III, and he overturned the 2 pence law, or the 2 penny act, as it was known. Well, that attracted Patrick Henry's attention again, and he, like a lot of other people, were kind of incensed. He said about it, "A king, by annulling or disallowing acts so salutary," which means helpful, "a nature, from being father of his people, degenerated into a tyrant, and forfeits all rights to his subjects' obedience." He was really ticked off, eh? So then came the Stamp Act, and the Stamp Act was dreamed up in 1765 by Britain, and it wanted to try to tax the 13 colonies in the United States, which would become the United States. And so they were taxing things like paper. So each piece of paper you bought came with a stamp, and that stamp paid money to the British Crown so they could, do whatever they wanted. And the real beef that the colonists had was that they had no representation. They could not go to Parliament to see how the money was being spent and vote for or against it. They weren't against taxes so much as they were against taxation without representation. Well, in time, Patrick Henry became a little more famous, And he went to what's called the Second Virginia Convention, where he also was met with George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. Both are pretty famous guys, and all of them, there's 5 or 6 of them from that particular meeting, signed the Declaration of Independence. And this is where Patrick Henry said his most famous thing. He wrote and said, "Gentlemen may cry, peace, peace, but there is no peace. The war is actually begun. The next gale that sweeps from the north will bring to our ears the clash of resounding arms. Our brethren are already in the fields. Why stand we idle here? Is life so dear, or peace so sweet, as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty, or give me death." So what he's talking about is liberty from slavery, and he's saying that if he doesn't do this now, he will ultimately end up as a slave to King George III, which, by the way, was pretty common. It was known as serfdom. And what would happen is that a lord would come along and say, "This little piece of land now belongs to me, and everybody who has their little farms on it is now owned by me, and all of those people will pay me most of their money and get to keep a little for working it for me." That was the system. Not a good system, especially if you've been out from underneath the proverbial thumb for a while. So that began a thing which in the USA was a loathing of central government. Yes, they hate federal government. Patrick Henry was an anti-federalist. He was suspicious because he did not trust central governments because he had lived under a king who was a central government. What was there to not to be suspicious of, right? So he went ahead and he helped create what was known as the Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights, you have to bear in mind why he was doing this, and think that a person who's writing these rules is doing it because these are things that have already been violated. You don't need to write rules for things that don't go wrong. So here they are. The government shall not make a religion. You know the gun laws, I'll skip that. No soldiers shall be allowed to be billeted in times of peace without owner's consent, that is of the house. You can't just send your troops in and have them stick around. Unreasonable search and seizure are not allowed, and warrants will not be issued that do not specify where and when things will be searched. You cannot be tried more than once for the same thing. You can't do it over and over till you get the right verdict. Trials will be speedy and impartial, and the jury will be drawn from the people in the area in which the offense was committed. Why? Well, because you don't want some bunch of yahoos who are going to find you guilty who are from somewhere else, and you don't want somebody left languishing in a dungeon. Suits for over $20 are subject to a jury. Bail and fines will be reasonable, and punishment shall not be cruel and unusual. Think of torture. Because these rights are guaranteed do not mean that other rights do not exist. And the power shall rest with the states or the people, which has been explicitly assigned to them, not with the federal government. In other words, we'll give you whatever powers in the federal Constitution, but not anymore. And so, that is the story of Patrick Henry. Now, ultimately, those 10 things called the Bill of Rights were part of the first 10 amendments to the United States Constitution. So you see, you've got a bunch of really super left-wing people who call themselves Americans. And you got a few people like me whose parents and grandparents, or, well, my pick, I think it was about 5 greats ago, ran off to northwestern Ontario, or southern Ontario, and were farmers. Today, if you're a conservative, are you aiming to go back to having a king? Are you tired of making decisions for yourself and thinking for yourself? Did Donald Trump really appeal to you? Did you like the idea that somebody was going to kick some butt without anybody to answer to? Was it good that he was belittling other people all the time and lying? Was it a great idea that he was paying people off? Did you like the idea that one man used his power to forgive a bunch of criminals and then got out? He was a conservative. If you like those things, that's what you're gunning for. If you're not a conservative now, good for you. If you are, think twice, because what you're asking for is another Donald Trump somewhere. And God knows you do not want to live under a tyrant. My name's Patrick Stewart. I never vote conservative, and you shouldn't either.